The custom settings menu on Nikon DSLRs is by far the largest menu. In this video, we'll go through each custom settings menu option on the D600. I have some links at the end of this video for my videos on the other D600 menus. So let's take a look at the custom settings menu.
This menu is broken down into 7 sections: autofocus, metering/exposure, timers/AE lock, shooting/display, bracketing/flash, controls, and movie. At the top here, you see Reset Custom Settings, which will set all of the settings in this menu back to their defaults. The first section is A, Autofocus. The top 2 options are regarding how the camera reacts when you press the shutter release button and it can't find focus. Looking at AFC priority selection, you have 2 options. You can choose Release, where the camera will take a photo regardless of if it can find focus. You also have Focus, where you can only take photos when they are in focus. The related option is AFS priority selection. You have the same 2 options. You have Release, where the photos can be taken no matter what, and you have Focus, where a photo can only be taken when the camera can find focus. The next option down is Focus Tracking with Lock On. This only applies when you are in continuous servo autofocus in AFA or in AFC. This is how the camera reacts to sudden or large changes in the distance from the camera to the subject. The idea is that if something comes through the frame, the camera won't get confused by it and try to focus on it instead of your subject. You can choose how long the camera will wait to refocus, or you can have it off. Now for AF point illumination. The idea here is to make sure you are able to see your autofocus point in the viewfinder. You have 3 options. First, you can choose Auto, where your selected autofocus point is highlighted in red when the camera thinks it needs to be. Then you have On, where your selected autofocus point is always highlighted in red. And then you have Off, where the selected autofocus point is never highlighted and is always just a black rectangle. Next is Focus Point Wraparound. When you are moving through your focus points using your multi-selector, do you want to be stopped at the edge, or do you want the focus point to come out the opposite side, like when you're playing Pac-Man? How many focus points do you want? You can choose 39 points or 11 points. 39 points is great if you have time to move through them, but 11 is for those times when you need to move that focus point around quickly. Now, do you want the built-in Autofocus Assist Illuminator to be on or off? When you choose On, there are some conditions that have to be met for it to actually light up. You need to be in poor lighting and in single servo autofocus. You also need to either be in auto area autofocus or have the center autofocus point selected if you are in single point autofocus. Now for section B, metering/exposure. Your first 2 options here control the increments used when making adjustments to certain items that control exposure. For both of them, you have 2 options, 1/3 step and 1/2 step. The first is ISO sensitivity step value. This controls your ISO sensitivity setting. Next is exposure value steps for exposure control. This controls the increments used when making adjustments to shutter speed, aperture, and bracketing. Next, we have easy exposure compensation. This is where you decide how to set exposure compensation. Let's start at the bottom with Off. If you choose Off for this option, you can set exposure compensation by pressing the +- button on the top of the camera and rotating the main command dial. Next is On. Here you can set exposure compensation by using only the command dials. Which compensation dial you use depends on your exposure mode because you use your command dials to set other things too. If you are in aperture priority, you use the main command dial on the back of the camera. If you're in shutter priority or program mode, you use the sub-command dial on the front of the camera. Choosing this option, the exposure compensation will stay as you set it until you change it again. Now with the last option, On Auto Reset. You can adjust exposure compensation just like you can with the On feature. However, when the exposure meter turns off, your adjustment is reset to 0. The next menu item is Center Weighted Area. Here you choose how your camera calculates exposure when using center weighted metering. You choose the diameter of the circle in the center of the frame, 8 mm, 12 mm, 15 mm, or 20 mm, or you can choose Average, which averages the entire frame. The last item on the metering/exposure portion of the menu is Fine-Tune Optimal Exposure. As the name suggests, you are able to fine-tune the exposure value the camera selects. When you go here, you get an alert. The exposure compensation icon will not be displayed when exposure is altered from the default value. Okay, now you see your 3 options. They are your metering modes: matrix metering, center weighted metering, and spot metering. You can adjust these in steps of 1/6 EV.
Let's talk about this one for a moment because I have a couple of notes for you on this option. We saw an alert. It said that the exposure compensation icon will not be displayed when exposure is altered from the default value. This means that if you set the fine tuning, your camera isn't going to tell you anywhere but in this menu that you have adjusted the exposure. If you go in and use the exposure compensation button to adjust exposure while you're shooting, that will show up in all the regular places, but it isn't going to add in the fine tuning.
Now we have section C, Timers/AE Lock. The first option on this section of the menu is Shutter Release Button AEL, and your options are on or off. If you select on, exposure will lock when the shutter release button is half pressed. If you select off, exposure will continue to adjust until the photo is taken. Next is Standby Timer, where you can set how long the camera meters exposure when you aren't actually doing anything. You have options ranging from 4 seconds to 30 minutes, and you also have no limit, where it is always on. Be careful with no limit though, because it is going to eat up the battery life if the camera is constantly measuring and calculating when you have the camera on, but it's just sitting around your neck or on a tripod. And now for Self Timer. You can turn the Self Timer on the release mode dial up here, but you configure it in this menu option. You set the delay, or how long the camera waits between pressing the shutter release button and when it takes the actual photo. You can choose 2, 5, 10, or 20 seconds. You choose the number of shots it will take. You can have up to 9. And then you have the interval between shots, a half a second, 1 second, 2 seconds, or 3 seconds.
These self-timer options on the D600 and other newer Nikon models make it very similar to the interval timer, which we talked about in my video on the shooting menu of the Nikon D600. In a lot of cameras, like my D300S, you can only set the self-timer to take one photo per button press. This newer feature of choosing how many shots and at what interval makes the self-timer a much more useful feature. You still have more flexibility in the interval timer though.
Monitor Off Delay is where you choose how long your LCD screen will stay on when no operation is being performed. There are several reasons why you use your LCD screen, and you can set each one separately. You have playback, menus, information display, and image review. For each of these, you can set the time from 4 seconds to 10 minutes. For live view, you have from 5 to 30 minutes and no limit. You'll want to choose shorter durations if you're interested in conserving battery life. The last menu item in this section is Remote On Duration. This is for use with the optional remote and determines how long the camera will stay on in standby when you are in remote release mode. Now for D, Shooting/Display. The first item is Beep. The camera can beep at you when it does certain things, like when it finds focus in single servo autofocus. Do you want it to beep? You can turn it off under Volume, where you can also tell it how loud to beep. And then under Pitch, you can choose a low or high pitch. Viewfinder Grid Display is either on or off. If it's on, you'll see grid lines in your viewfinder. ISO Display and Adjustment has 3 options. If you choose Show Frame Count, the frame count will be displayed in the control panel. If Show ISO Sensitivity is chosen, you will see the ISO number in the control panel instead of the frame count. And if you choose Show ISO/Easy ISO, the ISO number will be shown in place of the number of exposures remaining in the control panel. And ISO sensitivity can be adjusted by rotating the sub-command dial in Program and Shutter Priority modes, and by rotating the main command dial in Aperture Priority mode. Next is Screen Tips. If you choose On, tips will be shown on the info screen when an item is selected. Next is Continuous Low Mode Shooting Speed. This is the maximum number of frames per second you can capture in continuous low. You have the option of choosing from 1 to 5 frames per second. Incidentally, during interval timer shooting, this option also determines the max frame rate for single frame shooting. Next is Max Continuous Release, the maximum number of shots that can be taken in a single burst in continuous mode. You can choose any number between 1 and 100. File Number Sequence determines how your files are numbered. When you choose On, the file is numbered by adding 1 to the last number used or the largest file number in the current folder, whichever is higher. When you get to 9999, the camera begins again at 0001. If you choose Off, file numbering is reset every time a new folder is created, the memory card is formatted, or a new memory card is inserted. Last, if you choose Reset, the file is numbered by adding 1 to the largest file number in the current folder. If the folder is empty, the file numbering starts at 0001. Information Display is next, where you choose how the display will appear. You can choose auto, where the color of the screen and lettering are determined automatically, or you can choose manual, where you have two options, either dark letters on a light screen or light letters on a dark screen. Next is LCD illumination. If you choose on, the control panel will be illuminated whenever the exposure meters are active. If you choose off, the panel will only be illuminated when the power switch is rotated towards the light bulb symbol. Exposure delay mode. You can set the camera to have a slight delay in releasing the shutter after the mirror is raised. The purpose of this is to have the camera on a tripod and be able to press the shutter release button and let the camera go while the mirror flips up to eliminate any camera shake. Your options are off and 1, 2, or 3 seconds. Flash warning is next. If you select on, the flash ready indicator, which looks like a cross between a lightning bolt and an arrow, will flash in the viewfinder if the flash is needed. Next is MBD14 battery type. The MBD14 is the optional battery grip that can be purchased for the D600. If you do have it, you can choose which type of battery you're using in your grip here. Last in this section is battery order. This is also for if you're using the battery grip. You can choose to use the camera's battery first or the grip's batteries first. Now for section E, bracketing/flash. The first option is flash sync speed. You have options ranging from 1/200th of a second to 1/60th of a second for flash sync speed. Then you also have two different auto options here, 1/250th and 1/200th. When in aperture priority or program mode, these allow a compatible flash unit to be used at the highest shutter speed that the camera can, which then allows you to use the maximum aperture available to achieve a narrower depth of field. This becomes especially important when your subject is backlit. Next is flash shutter speed. This allows you to set the slowest shutter speed available when you are using front or rear curtain sync or red eye reduction in program mode or aperture priority. You can choose between 1/60th of a second to 30 seconds. Flash control for built-in flash is next. Here you choose how your pop-up flash behaves. You can choose TTL, which stands for through the lens, and you have the camera automatically decide how much light the situation needs. You can choose manual and decide yourself how much light you want, anywhere from full power to 1/128th power. Then you have repeating flash, where the flash fires repeatedly while the shutter is open, giving you a strobe-like effect. You have options within this, output, times, and frequency. You also have commander mode, where you can use the pop-up flash as the master for remote flash units. You have setup options here too.
If you put an SB400 speed light on your camera and turn it on, this option appears as optional flash. You're able to choose through the lens for the camera to determine the amount of flash needed, or manual for you to decide what the flash power is going to be.
Exposure compensation for flash is next. You have two options to control how the camera adjusts the flash output when exposure compensation is used. You have entire frame, where both the flash level and the exposure compensation are adjusted to change the exposure on the entire frame, or you have background only, where exposure compensation applies to the background only. Next is modeling flash, which you can set to on or off. When you choose on, a modeling flash will appear when the camera depth of field preview button is pressed and you have the pop-up flash up, or you are using a CLS compatible flash unit. Auto bracketing set has a few options. You can choose which settings are bracketed when auto bracketing is in effect. You can choose auto exposure and flash, auto exposure only, flash only, white balance bracketing, this isn't available if you're shooting in RAW, or active D-lighting bracketing. The last item in this section is bracketing order. Here you determine the order in which the camera brackets. You can have it shoot where the camera is metered, then under, then over, or you can have it shoot low to high. Now to section F, controls. First is OK button, shooting mode. You can set what you want to happen when the OK button is pressed during shooting. You can choose for it to reset to the center focus point, highlight the active focus point, or not do anything. Now we have a sign function button. Here we get to decide what the function button will do. It can serve a lot of different purposes. The default is for it to choose image area, but let's start from the top of the list. You can have the button act as a depth of field preview button or lock flash value. You can have it lock focus and exposure while the button is held down, or you have three options for locking exposure only. It can initiate autofocus, or you can set it to turn the flash off while the button is pressed. It can be set to activate bracketing, Or if you press and hold the button and turn the rear command dial, you can activate active D-lighting, or you can have the camera record a raw image in addition to a JPEG image if the button is pressed prior to releasing the shutter. Or the next 3 activate a metering mode while the button is pressed. You can have it used with the command dials to turn the grid in the viewfinder on or off. You can have it used with the command dials to choose your image area. It can display a virtual horizon in the viewfinder. You can have it display your My menu, which we'll talk about in a different video. Or you can have it access the top item in your My menu. You can use it with the command dials to make changes to shutter speed and aperture in steps of 1 EV. You can use it with the command dials again to choose a non-CPU lens number, which we'll talk more about in the video on the D600 setup menu. You can also set it to behave like the playback button, or you can have the button do nothing. Next, you can assign preview button, which is above the function button on the front of the camera. The options here are the same as the options for the function button, so we won't go through them again. However, the default for this is to act as the depth of field preview button. The next menu option is Assign Auto Exposure Lock / Autofocus Lock button. You can have the button lock focus and exposure while it is pressed, which is the default. You have 2 options for it to lock exposure only. You can have it lock focus only, initiate autofocus, lock flash value, or do nothing. Now for customizing the command dials, where you can decide how the sub-command dial and main command dial work. You can set them to reverse rotation, where you reverse the direction that you turn the dials when making adjustments to exposure compensation and/or shutter speed and aperture. You choose them by pressing the right arrow on the multi-selector. You can also have the dial swap places, or just change places when in aperture priority. You can also decide if aperture is to be adjusted using the sub-command dial or the aperture ring on the lens if it has one. Last, you can set the camera to allow you to use the command dials to navigate through the menus and playback, or in menus and playback except image review. The next menu item is Release Button to Use Dial. This is a simple on or off. Do you want to have to hold down buttons like the exposure compensation button or the white balance button while turning dials to make adjustments, which is no, or would you rather be able to release the button and still make changes by rotating the dials until the meter turns off or the shutter release button is pressed halfway, which is yes. Now, what do you want to happen when you forget to put a memory card in the camera? Do you want the camera to lock up and not release the shutter, or do you want it to allow the shutter to release? Next is reverse indicators. The default is for your exposure indicator to be low on the left, high on the right. However, you can flip it. The last item in this section is Assign MBD14 Auto Exposure Autofocus Lock button. Remember that the MBD14 is the optional battery grip. It has an auto exposure autofocus lock button, which can be assigned to do various tasks regarding autofocus, flash value, and auto exposure. And finally, to section G, Movie. The first option is Assign Function button, which you'll remember is on the front of the camera. You can decide what will happen when you press the function button during Movie Live View. First is Index Marking, where you can add an index in the current position by pressing the button during recording. Or you can view photo shooting info, which will display shooting data instead of movie recording data. You also have several options for it to lock exposure and/or autofocus or initiate autofocus. Or you could have the button do nothing, which is the default. Next is Assign Preview button, again on the front of the camera above the function button. These options are the same except that the default is Index Marking. Next is Assign Auto Exposure / Autofocus Lock button. The options are the same as the function button and the preview button, but the default is Auto Exposure / Autofocus Lock. And the very last option in the custom settings menu is Assign Shutter button. This sets how the shutter release button will behave when you are in Movie Live View. You can choose to have the button end recording and take a photo when you fully press the shutter release button, or you can have it start Movie Live View when you press the shutter release button halfway, then focus if you half press again, then start or end recording when fully pressed.
As you can see, the custom settings menu has so many options. As the name suggests, you can really customize how your camera behaves. I'm working my way through all of the menus. As they become available, I'll be letting you know on my Facebook page and adding links here. Let me know if you have any questions.